Welcome to Time for Hope, a faith-based mental health program. Join our host, certified clinical mental health counselor and Christian psychotherapist Dr. Freda Crews, and her guests as they discuss real-life issues and offer expert clinical advice and solid biblical application for any and all life situations. Now, here's the host of Time for Hope, Dr. Freda Crews.
Welcome to another edition of Time for Hope. I'm Dr. Freda Crews, your host, and today, as promised, for the second and concluding week, I would like to welcome as my guest, author and psychologist, Dr. Welch. Dr. Welch serves on the faculty of Denver Seminary and has over 20 years of experience in clinical psychology. Today, Dr. Welch and I will wrap up the discussion of his book titled The Controlling Husband. Dr. Welch and I intend, as we end our discussion related to controlling husbands, to leave you with hope for a transformed marriage. God's original design for marriage was for husbands and wives to enjoy their love, companionship, and intimacy unhindered by selfishness, while learning to communicate their individual needs within the marriage. Asking God for His help and direction can grow His design into a transformed marriage, with neither being a controller. Ron, we like to keep our promises, and we promised that we were going to pick up with that question. Why do wives stay in controlling relationships? And we could go even to your wife. How long did she stay in the relationship before she realized something's not right here?
I wish I could say that I listened to her on our first anniversary, because she said, I feel like a bird in a gilded cage. I can't do what I want. I can't be who I want to be. You've got all these rules, and you're jealous, and you're not listening to me. And the great story would be, wow, I just suddenly turned around and changed and everything was wonderful. It was probably 8 to 10 years of us going back and forth, of her putting up with my not listening, not being aware of what I was doing, or if I was aware, not wanting to change. It was too threatening. It was too scary for me to care more about her and what was happening and to address what had happened in my life. I used a variety of I think a lot of guys use a variety of techniques. Sometimes
Such as intimidating, manipulating, a powder. Were you a powder?
Oh, I pouted good. I was an excellent powder. Yeah, I've got that one down real well. I can make certain that if I'm not happy, I make sure everyone else around me is unhappy too. I'm real good at that.
How about remaining mute?
Silent treatment. Yeah, I can certainly use that one and just kind of make certain that nothing gets said, and then you make your point without having to say anything.
And then your paranoia came out, that fear that you would lose control, right?
Sometimes it's as simple as sports. Doesn't even have to be real intense.
It's on the list. Where does that fit in?
It can be, if it's football day, then that's what's on TV, or that's what the family does. I'm a coach. I coach high school sports, I coach youth sports, and I watch families where if it's baseball day, nothing else that's going on matters. They're going to go to that baseball game. So my wife would sit through hours of baseball games or whatever else, and it wasn't until halfway through our marriage that I started realizing, how is it that we just do that? Why do we just watch the football game after church, or what? And I started realizing it's because she went along with whatever I wanted to do, and we never stopped to say, hey, we have an entire day free today. What would you like to do? What would make your heart warm? What would you? And so what we've started doing now, it's kind of funny. We have a bigger problem now, because if we're wanting to do something, we both try to make certain the other person is getting their way. So I'll say, well, what would you like to do, honey? And she'll say, I don't know. What would you like to do? And I have to pull over the road sometimes off to the side and say, where are we going? Because I don't know what to. But we're both trying to listen to what the other one wants. And that's such a better, healthy process than the way it was before.
That's so biblical too, Ron.
Yes.
When you go to the scriptures, it is amazing how often, and especially in the New Testament, when we are told that we are to look out for the other person rather than being all taken up with our needs and our desires, and being, thinking we're the big honcho and so on and so forth. I sometimes wonder how many of God's children get it and read those verses and don't just slide over them, because it doesn't even happen in churches very often, actually. I've observed that servanthood doesn't come easy.
Well, you would think that the divorce rate would be lower in Christian families than non-Christian families if we were applying all these principles, but that's not true.
That's
the
not
divorce
true.
rates are the same.
I just saw, and this is off the path, but I just saw a stat that just so alarmed me, and that was, and I'm not going to put out a percentage, but that a pretty high percentage of pastors are addicted to porn.
Oh, I believe that, absolutely.
That was so hard. I knew that many men in the congregations were, but when it came down to pastors, you know, I didn't expect that.
There's all these kind of secrets that people can't talk about or can't share, and then they keep it to themselves and they keep doing it. One of the best things, one of the reasons that I think you're going to like this, one of the reasons that I think this book is so powerful is because of the concept of hope, right? Because if a woman is thinking, I can't change him, what I hear all the time is that's just who he is, he can never be any different,
and this
I'm
is gonna
stuck
be my
with
life,
him.
So I need to settle in and accept it.
Just grin and bear it.
Yeah.
And that's one of in answer to your original question about why women stay, that's one of the reasons, because they think it's kind of my lot in life. It's what submission means. I'm just supposed to submit.
I got myself into it, and I can handle it, or I'm going to have to handle it.
And if it were not a marriage in which they were looking at the long-term, lifelong marriage concept, then they would say, well, okay, I guess I can just get out. But for Christian wives, there's this conflict because they say, he's not bad enough to divorce. He hasn't had an affair. He hasn't hit me, but he's a jerk, right? That's me. And so my wife, I'll talk to Jan at times and I'll say, you know, your friends were saying, just get out while you could. Why didn't you leave? And she'll say, I saw things in you that I knew God could do that you had no idea about yourself.
You are so fortunate.
Tell me, it works. It's so helpful when you marry someone like that. The problem is for her, it took her way too long to set her own boundaries and say, I love you and I want you to be better, and you can't do this anymore. And that's one of the things that I hope the women listening to your show will understand, is that they're not helping by giving in.
Even with being submitted wives, they have every right to say that and say, things have to change around here.
Now, in order to do that, they would have to get over their fear of his anger. And to me, that's one of the things that is so powerful.
Anger is a big thing in this control issue,
It's scary because, I mean, and it doesn't have to be yelling and screaming. I could stand up and block a doorway to make my point, and that's an abusive kind of behavior.
Did you do that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I've known that to go on with controlling husbands, they think as long as they don't lay a hand on the woman, but they can have, you know, absolute control, as it were.
I never hit my wife, I never hit Jan, but I certainly was intimidating and manipulative in all sorts of different ways to make certain that I made my point.
Manipulative. So many men are. And even especially young, while they're young and wanting to get married, and the hormones are flowing and all that kind of stuff.
And then the patterns get set in, and that's how they relate for the remainder of their marriage.
Yes, okay. So why are women staying in these controlling marriages? Tell me again.
So one is fear of anger, of what's going to happen if I say something.
Most men that are controllers are angry men, okay?
And second is the learned helplessness process that happens when, do you remember years ago, back before we had all the animal agencies, they used to do those cat studies? They'd have a cat on an electrical grid. And the cat would jump, and they'd shock the poor cat, and it would land back on the grid, and they'd shock it again. It would keep. At some point, cats are pretty smart animals, and the cat would lay down and look at the person and say, you can shock me, but I'm not jumping for you, right? Well, that's what happens for women in marriages at times. They kind of figure, this is horrible, I hate it, I wish it wouldn't happen, but there's really no use trying to fight it. It's just going to happen, so I'll just lay down and let it happen. And that's not the answer to changing the problem.
And very often, there are the children to consider, and women are usually the ones that will give the most consideration to what divorce would do to the children. And I can witness that and have witnessed that even with some of my own children and what it has done for the grandchildren. And it's not a pretty sight. It is not a pretty sight to see them go through that and the grandchildren have to suffer as a result.
And they're teaching all those children those patterns, which is why we have this ongoing cycle from generation to generation of manipulation and control.
So we've covered some of the reasons why wives stay. Fear of anger, fear of learned helplessness, fear of love, loss, and abandonment. Yeah. Some women are so hungry to be loved, and no matter what it costs them, until they will stay. Right. That comes from the home of environment as a general rule, the early familial home of environment, and the submission issue. And then we come down to the question, Ron, of leadership or control. What's the difference between you being the leader in the home, as the scriptures would indicate you are to be, and you being the controller?
I think that's the good news we have to share with your listeners and your viewers, is that there are very clear ways we can change this. It doesn't have to be the way it is. And women don't have to say, I'm stuck, I can't do anything about it. There's some very clear ideas of how we can overcome that so that a man can be a leader in the household, not a controller or a dominator or a manipulator.
And you know what? That's where we're going to pick up when we come back, because they're whispering in my ear that it's time for a break. And that's a good place to pick up, headed towards the hope that we promise to give these people in transforming their marriage. And we will be right back. I would assume the average couple getting married would never conceive of their marriage as being a fixer-upper, but instead would probably view their marriage as a brand new house. But before long, this fantasy will be shattered with the reality that their new house of marriage has inherent defects that went unrecognized until the pressure of being lived in caused them to surface. I have often made the statement, good marriages don't just happen. Instead, many need fixing up from the beginning, and all need regular maintenance. Admittedly, some couples have a special connection in love that provides them with a marriage that requires less fixing and maintenance than others. But none are exempt from learning through trial and error what it takes to fix and maintain a meaningful marriage. The statement, love is what makes the world go round, is especially true related to marriage. The scriptures relate that love covers a multitude of sins, and we could rephrase this as it relates to marriage by saying, love can be the glue that holds a couple together when the roof or walls of their marriage begin to leak or crumble. But for couples to entrust their marriage to their love for each other, they very often must redefine love. For many today, love immediately creates visions of sexual intimacy. Sexual love can be skin deep because it involves our physical being. However good the sexual connection is with a couple, it cannot be depended on to keep a house of marriage fixed up when the termites of stress, discord, anger, personality differences, and past wounds and need deprivation begin to eat away at the very foundation. Love is not always a feeling, and passion can fade when a mate becomes self-centered, inattentive, or abusive. A fixed and well-maintained marriage will require the kind of love that seeks the other's best interests, that allows a mate to maintain a strong sense of self and personhood, that intentionally seeks to understand and meet the other's healthy needs, that practices self-control when conflict pushes our anger button, and that is ready to forgive but not enable continuing unacceptable behavior. This kind of love will see couples through the inevitable struggles that will arise throughout their marriages and will keep them watchful for roof leakage or crumbling walls within their marital house. Thanks for staying with us on Time for Hope. We always appreciate you being there. And Ron, I appreciate having you, and we've had a good time.
Great to be here.
I've enjoyed interacting with you. A lot of chemistry going on because of our past experiences and counseling and so forth. And I know a lot about controlling husbands and controlling men, coming from the deep tradition of submission. I go way back with that and how women have had to make their way and understand what the scriptures are truly saying about submission. And we left off with that, the difference between headship and controlling and so forth. Let's pick up with, we promised to help them transform their marriage, okay? Let's pick up with transforming your marriage and how it begins. First thing is, somebody has to admit there's a problem, don't they?
Yeah, and that's a sticking point for some women I talk to, because I'll have women that will call in and say, I'd love to have this change, but my husband says there's no way I'm going to counseling, there's no way I'm changing, you're stuck with me. And that's a very difficult thing for people to identify and say, that makes them feel like, well, I guess I should just give up. My message to the wives who are with someone who isn't interested in changing is the first thing they need to do is start setting the boundaries themselves. We're certainly aware, as you mentioned earlier, that you have to be careful with violent situations or danger or anything in which a boundary like that could lead to danger. So you have to be careful about the consequences. But I can guarantee that if the woman continues to just go along with the manipulation and control, it's not going to change.
It can come to the same thing, actually.
And so sometimes she has to do things like not allow her voice to be ignored, or to identify ways in which and times in which you are most likely to have a successful interaction. So do you want to set a boundary at 10:30 at night when you're both tired and you're cranky? Probably not the best time. Or when he's on the way to work and you're leaving for work and you're going to say, well, now I'm going to tell you you're a jerk. Probably not a good time.
Wait on the right time.
Find the right time.
Timing is everything, isn't it?
I also suggest to women that they consider having other people present. If they're in a church and there's other men who are in marriages where they've learned some things from that, then it's good to have two couples sit down together and say, hey, let me tell you what it's like in our marriage, and give you a different model. And do you ever feel like that? It really helps.
There are some couples that actually make a ministry out of that, of finding out the needs and working with couples that have issues. I think that's a very effective way, actually, but I do recommend professional counseling.
Now, I will tell you the thing that I will say to the husbands who are not certain if they want to change, and the comment that I ask wives to share with their husbands if they would like to initiate change is, especially if he's a Christian, is to say, help me understand how not listening to me, not respecting me, and not empowering me is consistent with your faith. Just tell me how controlling me helps me grow closer to God. Because as a husband who's been a controller, I can't answer that question. There's nothing about that is trying to help her become closer to God. It's all about me. So it's a way to start that conversation.
I have a couple that are very close friends, and he's a very successful businessman. And I don't know how many times both of them were married before they're married to each other. But in the process, they became devout Christians with this marriage. And they have devotionals together every morning. And they have just grown such a beautiful relationship and marriage that I've encouraged them to write a book about it. And I've been after them for a good while. I got a note from him the other day, and he said, oh, our book is about halfway.
Outstanding.
We've got somebody helping us, and thanks so much for, staying behind us to get this book written. So it's going to be really interesting when it comes. They've already done it on my show, by the way. So anyway, seeing the light. A woman needs to wake up and see the light, doesn't she?
And I think there are some specific ways in which she can see that and understand that. When I wrote the book, I have 4 separate chapters that talk about some principles that are related to seeing the light and changing and transforming. And the first of those, as I'm sure you will agree, is hope. Because if the woman continues to believe he's going to be how he's always been, then they don't have any hope. You have to believe that things can get better.
It might take a lot of prayer, which is the power of faith, and we recommend that. Take it to the Lord. And
absolutely.
Remember that old song?
Yeah, sure.
All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Take it to the Lord. If anybody can bring change and empower us to do what you're suggesting, it can be the Lord.
It takes a miraculous
that does
change.
that. Power of children, we've talked about that, and the power of loss and power of love and loss. Some people don't want to lose what love they do have in the relationship. Let's move on. How can they engage and get these things across to each other? And you say, allow your partner to disengage when it gets too tough.
I think you have to be able to separate. You can't continue to force the issue when you know it's going down the wrong path. One of the things in the book that I think people will appreciate is a Niagara Falls metaphor that talks about one of the ways that I suggest couples find out where they are in the water and how close to the falls they are. And there's a whole section in the book talking about that. And part of that has to do with saying, if I could know when it was dangerous and get out of the water, then I could re-engage when it's safer. And rather than pushing the argument when the tone is starting to get louder and somebody's upset, I think it's better to take your time.
Take a break.
Yes. Good old-fashioned timeout. Right?
Yeah, good old-fashioned timeout. But don't forget to return to the discussion. Don't just leave it hanging when you take the time out. By the way, I've been to Niagara Falls. It brought back some great memories. There's also a thing about Niagara Falls that I've used in helping people come to know the Lord about trusting. Remember the guy that took it across went across the first time, and then he turned around and asked who would let him take them across in a wheelbarrow, and nobody agreed. Remember that story? But when we come to know the Lord, we literally have to be willing to get into the wheelbarrow by faith. And so I've used that, but it brought back some great memories about Niagara Falls. Let's move on. Think in terms of you're changing your marriage for a lifetime. You're not changing it for a few days. You're changing it for a lifetime. That's what a couple should be working towards. You agree with me on that?
And I think in order for that kind of change to happen, you have to have some very significant forgiveness occur. I don't think you can keep expecting things. I think what happens is the wives especially, my wife will tell you it was 4 or 5 years before she believed I was really going to change. She was fairly certain that I was going to be stuck in that role and be who I was. So I believe that you have to have the level of hope that we talked about. You have to have that change from selfishness to selflessness that we talked about earlier on. You have to have forgiveness in order to move forward rather than looking backward. And then I think one of the biggest things I work with couples on is spending as much time praising each other and building each other up as they do criticizing.
Oh, absolutely.
We spend so much time telling people what's wrong with the other person rather than building them up.
Finally, it comes down to praise. That's praise of each other. Hope. Okay. Forgiveness, which you have mentioned, and selflessness. I don't think you could have added another thing to those 4 things and wrap it up any better.
That's what we hope would be a recipe for transformation in a marriage.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I add to that, trust God.
Amen.
Trust God for the empowerment and whatever else it takes to do this. And forgiveness is a hard thing, but forgiveness does not mean forgetting. We don't have the ability to forget. What we need to do is leave the past in the past. You agree with me on that, don't you?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so we've named. I like this last note you made. Remember, we we never marry the person
That's right.
that we think we
We
married.
never marry the person we marry. As soon as we marry them, they're changing and growing, and if you're disappointed in that, you're going to be constantly disappointed in each other rather than pleased.
I enjoyed you coming so much.
Thanks
You've
for
done
having
a
me. I
great
appreciate it.
job, and I pray the Lord will use your book. And I'm encouraging you as one of my viewers to make sure you get a copy of Ron's book. It's subtitled "What Every Woman Needs to Know," and we could add "What Every Man Needs
We
to
could
Know."
indeed. Yes, indeed.
Very easily, couldn't we, Ron?
Absolutely.
And the Lord bless you and your ministry.
Thank you so much.
And then I have some things to share from our viewers again, as I always do. Dear Dr. Freda, my husband lies and cheats on me. Well, that cannot be in a long-term, lifetime marriage. I am tired of the way he treats me. That's good. That's an awakening that needs to come. Please pray for him to stop the lying and cheating, and pray for our marriage. But I have to add to this wife needs to know, as we've talked about, that she has the right to start calling some of the, could I call it, calling some of the shots?
I think so.
In a situation like this, and say, this has got to stop.
Yeah.
You know, and so find out what he's willing to do, and so forth. But yes, we will, and we have already taken this situation to the Lord in prayer. We hope that this dear wife can find a way out of all this pain she must be enduring. And then I have an encouragement. Dear Dr. Freda, Time for Hope is such a wonderful and helpful program. Thank you, and that's what we hope it is. And I am praying for all of you, and I greatly appreciate that, because our staff is very much involved in producing this program. Our guests are very much a part of our program. It takes a lot to put this program on the air and put it across the world. So if you haven't helped us financially do that, and can, I would greatly appreciate your asking the Lord about that and doing what you can. In the meantime, again, I encourage you to make sure, if you're in a controlling marriage, that you get a copy of Ron's book. And join us again next week on Time for Hope.
A free fact sheet that contains additional information about today's topic is available upon request from our ministry. You can also receive a copy of today's resource for a contribution of any amount to the Time for Hope ministry. Call us at 800-669-9133. Write us at Post Office Box 2169, Spartanburg, South Carolina 29304. Or visit our website at timeforhope.org. When you call or write, prayerfully consider a donation to our ministry. Our ministry's mission is to offer hope to discouraged and hurting people. As we continue to give out messages of hope, a financial gift of any amount to support this ministry will be greatly appreciated. When you do this, you are joining us in offering hope to many viewers seeking help and hope for their situation. This will also enable us to inform and inspire some viewers to expand our mission, as they learn and in turn can minister more effectively to hurting people around them. Until next time, have a great week. And remember, it is time for hope.